Hello, everyone. This is Dr. Alexander Rosenthal. You may notice the visuals are slightly different. My laptop is in laptop hospital today, but I have a webcam and we're ready to go. I'm here as usual with my friend and colleague, Dr. Miles Smit. I am, as you may know, the founder and director of the Petrarch Institute, and this is my colleague, Dr. Miles Smit. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Hello, everybody. Good to see you again, or if it's your first time joining us, good to see you. You're joining a series of podcasts in which we explore themes of classical education, classical learning, and we often look at its connection to the modern world. Last time around, Alex, we took a look at the challenges to classical education and the classical worldview in the modern world. And today we're going to offer some responses to those. But before we did that, in a month or so, Alex, I believe we have a course coming up. Did you want to tell people about that?
Yes, absolutely. So it's getting close, right? So October 1st, Wednesday, October 1st, will be our next course offering, which is on classical philosophy and the virtues. And we're going to be looking at two of the central philosophers in the classical tradition, Plato and Aristotle, who you see right in the middle of Raphael's famous painting behind me, on this question of what is the good life, right, and what are the virtues, right, what is courage and justice, how to live well, which is, I think, a topic that just about everyone should be of interest to just about everyone, and at, of course, our usual affordable prices. So October 1st, if you're interested, just send me an email. The website is www.petrarch-institute.com, and all the information about the courses will be there in the website. And if you have any questions, again, just email me. So there we are.
So last week, Alex, you took us through a number of challenges and critiques that have faced classical education, classical learning in the modern world, especially in the last 2 centuries or so. And you began by telling us about some social and economic pressures that it came up against. Did you want to briefly reprise that and then offer some thoughts on what can be said on behalf of the classical perspective?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. I mean, so the basic thing is that the classics, certainly through the 19th and I'd say into the early 20th centuries, were really the kind of core of university education, right? Really the foundation of university education. But there has been, although many more people go to universities today than in the past, the irony is there are actually fewer, as on a percentage basis, who are involved in the humanities and the classics, and it's instead become quite a, we could say, specialized field. So people's perspective on the purpose of a college education has changed quite dramatically. So it used to be thought of as that is the place where one acquires a liberal education, right, and the wisdom and understanding of wisdom and the virtues that classical education provides, right, and the self-development of the intellectual and moral faculties that it provides. Whereas today people think of college education, I would say, much more as sort of the ticket to middle-class life, right? People need employment, and nowadays it can be perceived at least as difficult to acquire employment if you don't have a college education, and moreover, the thoughts about education are now focused on acquiring the skills, the technical or vocational skills necessary to succeed in a career, which is a very understandable concern. So the question is how to address that, right? So, I mean, there are 3 ideas that I'd want to say about this. The first is it's not an either-or thing. Of course, learning how to do Excel or spreadsheets or business accounting or whatever it is that you need for your career is going to be vital, right? Acquiring those technical skills. But there's no inherent conflict between acquiring both a technical education and a liberal education, right? Which aims not at developing the particular skills you need at a particular task, but at developing the human being as such, right? There's no inherent conflict. Now, if college education becomes perceived as no longer the place where one acquires a liberal education, right? If that's the increasing trend, as it seems to be in many places, then we have to think of other ways in which we can do both, right? And that's why I think something like Petrarch is very valuable, right? Because you don't need to sideline your career, right? You don't need to even pursue classics or philosophy or humanities as a major, right? There are ways in which you can acquire the riches of a liberal arts education, without in any way endangering yourself as a career. And that's why I think things like the Petrarch Institute are particularly valuable, right? And there are many people, like I said, who have started on a career. They majored in college for the purpose of getting some sort of career, but they also had an interest in the classics that never got cultivated, or an interest in liberal education that never got cultivated. And for those kinds of people, things like the Petrarch Institute are, I think, very valuable. Now, the other thing is this claim that, for example, philosophy and classics are not useful is by no means new, right? This has been something it has faced for a long time. And I think it's interesting to look back on how Aristotle addresses this issue, right? Is philosophy useful? Is the pursuit of wisdom useful? Right? Philosophy is the love of wisdom. Is the love of wisdom useful? And he writes in his work, the Pragmatism, which is devoted. It's a work which exists mostly in fragments. It's not a complete. It's one of Aristotle's earlier works that I talked about in a different podcast. And it's devoted entirely to this subject. And this is what he writes. He says, to seek from every kind of knowledge that some other thing come into being from it, and that it must be useful, is the act of someone completely ignorant of how great the distance is between things that are noble and things that are necessary, for the difference is vast. Those things that are loved for the sake of some other thing, which one cannot live without, should be called necessities and secondary causes. But those that are loved for themselves, even if no other thing results from them, should be called goods in the strict sense. So what is Aristotle saying? If we say, can we identify the good simply with the useful? Well, if we do that, there's a problem, because things are useful for the sake of something else, right? And that something else is usually something we consider more valuable, right? So, for example, plumbing is an absolute necessity, and thank God for plumbing and plumbers and people who could do that, right? But very few people would do it just for its own sake, right? We love it because of what it, because it fulfills some sort of necessity, right? But what the classics and liberal arts education, philosophy, right, are aiming at are things which have a proper excellence in themselves, right? Wisdom, virtue, right? These things. So this is, this would be his argument as far as that. But then there's another thing, which is that in fact they are also useful, right? In addition to having their proper excellence in themselves, the classics are also useful because they develop, for example, the intellectual faculties, right? The creative and intellectual faculties of the mind, which can then be applied to a multiplicity of tasks, right? The particular technical skills that you learn now that we learned in the 1950s, right? Even the 1980s, just about everything I learned about computers in the 1980s is completely useless to me now, right? I mean, we don't use BASIC typically in programming and this sort of thing. But the development of the mind and its creative and intellectual faculties that one gets from the liberal education are something which are continuously useful. And maybe I'll just close on this point with something that Cardinal Jacopo Sadoleto, an educator of the Renaissance, wrote. He said, those who having come so far and having long found a nursing mother in philosophy turn afterwards to other pursuits in life, whether the civil law be their pursuit, or the service of the state in peace and war, or any other art or mode of life that leads to honor and renown, may be sure that to whatever they devote themselves, they will take with them greatly increased store both of facility in entering and of wisdom and determination in fulfilling their task. So there you have Sadoleto's pitch for the liberal and philosophic education.
It's a pretty decent pitch indeed. Alex, to underscore what you were saying, I think that one of the inspiring motives or the signposts to our founding the Petrarch were the large number of people we ran into in the private sector who had the education, the credentials, the experience that are the requisites of doing business, but whose regret, if that's the right word, was that in college and otherwise in the way they'd spent their time, they hadn't had a chance to acquaint themselves with Aristotle or Thomas Aquinas or even Thomas Jefferson. So
right.
That idea of the remedial value for the completion of the person and also for the long-term, more than transactional fulfillment of the business character is a really relevant point. But even within the academy, I guess, it's safe to say, indeed, I think we said last week, Alex, that the classical worldview experienced shocks and challenges in the 19th and 20th century. Last week you talked a fair bit about Dewey.
Yeah, absolutely, right. So if we remember from last week, from part one, Dewey had, there were three central core elements to his philosophy of education, and Dewey is a sort of a giant in American education. I mean, he's often thought of as sort of the godfather of American public school education, right? So his ideas about what education is about and what it should be achieved have been immensely influential. But they also work against, I think, it's safe to say, they work against the traditional classical education, right, in many respects. So there were three elements to his worldview, right, and I talked about how each of them contributes to the tension with classical education, right? One is progressivism, two is instrumentalism, and third is, we could say, the democratic critique of elitism, right? And those three things together constitute a kind of critique that he has of the traditional, what he calls the reactionaries, right? Those who want to, say, preserve the classical education. So maybe it'd be somewhat valuable to go through each of them in turn and try to offer some responses. No? Okay, so I'll start with progressivism, right? So what was the basic idea of progressivism? I mean, it's a notion of history as moving from more primitive to more advanced modes of society, right? And Dewey will emphasize that the modern world has basically left the ancient and medieval world in the dust, as it were, right? Through these three revolutions of the scientific revolution, the industrial technological revolution, and the democratic revolution, right? And because of these three things and the fact that these societies, right, ancient Greek society, medieval society, right, that they were pre-scientific and pre-technological, whatever ideas they had about education might have been well adapted to that kind of society, but don't have much to say to our more advanced and progressive form of society. So I would say that, in a nutshell, would be the critique. So how to respond? Okay, so on progressivism. Well, the first thing is I would distinguish facts and wisdom, right? And I think this is something Leo Strauss talks about a bit, right? I mean, absolutely, the facts that we have now about the size of the periodic table, about the reproductive habits of various animals, right, about embryology, right? And there's no question that there are vastly more facts today, right? But the value of the classics is partly that they raise perennial questions that I don't think really grow old. What is virtue? What is beauty? right? What is the best way to live? What is the good life, right? What is truth, right? All these fundamental questions were raised by them and were thought, they thought very deeply about these problems. Now, maybe we don't fully agree with their answers, right? We can argue they started what Hutchins called the Great Conversation, right? Maybe we don't fully agree with their answers in those respects, but we need, I think, to understand them in order to approach these problems fruitfully. So the first thing is the question of, are there not certain perennial problems which face the human condition in every generation, right, and which don't really grow old? And this is precisely, I think, what we think of when we think of the classics, right? I mean, think of something as prosaic. Has the Parthenon grown uglier? The last 25 centuries, right? This sort of thing. Now, the second thing, which I think is very vital to talk about, and we've touched on it before in a previous lecture, the one we did on achievement, how the classics fueled achievement. Would there be a scientific revolution without the classics? Right? Would there be a scientific revolution without the classics? Modern science relies on two elements. Induction and mathematics, right, have been completely crucial and central to the development of the modern sciences. Both those things are part of the Greek inheritance, right? What Aristotle called epagoge, right, inductive reasoning, looking at many cases of the thing, right, the technique of observation, and Aristotle, was one of these first people to look at all the different kinds of things, different kinds of animals and geology and all these sorts of things, and start classifying them, right? So that sort of observational approach to nature, and then mathematics, right? And you think of Pythagoras and Euclid and these sorts of figures. These have really been the building blocks of the modern scientific revolution. And while the facts that we have today may look antiquated 300 years from now, right? If the record of past achievement has anything to teach us on that score, the fundamental building blocks of the sciences, the approach of rational inquiry, is very unlikely to grow old, and in fact will probably be the fuel of future achievements in the sciences. And as we talked last time, many of the greatest scientists of the 20th century, right, many of the great names in physics, Max Planck, and Werner Heisenberg, and all these figures, Charles Darwin, right, were people who were deeply admiring and one can often say immersed in the classics. So that's I'd say the second thing to say there. So then the third issue would be this critique of. Oh yes. Well, did I discuss instrumentalism yet?
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay, so let me get to instrumentalism. Right. So what he basically argues is that. Okay, so I'll just take a quote from Dewey. Right. So basically, instrumentalism is the idea which puts the emphasis on utility. Right. So what Dewey basically argues, he says, what perhaps is not equally obvious is that the marvelous advance in natural science has come about because of the breaking down of the wall existing in ancient and medieval institutions between higher things of a purely intellectual and spiritual character and lower things of a practical and material nature. So Dewey doesn't like that distinction, which I think is already hinted on in the Aristotle quote that I made, right? Things that have their own proper excellence and things which are useful, toward things which have their own proper excellence, right? And this is it. Now, the emphasis that Dewey has is that the modern science involved overcoming the classics, right? But I think I've already addressed that to a degree, right? To a large degree, the modern sciences are founded on the classics, right? And I use the example of induction and mathematics, which modern science built on, right? I mean, you could say that it was built on these classical foundations. The other thing is, I mean, I think that Dewey raises a good and interesting point, which is probably a debate worth having, right? the ancient and the medieval worlds tended to privilege excellence of the soul over excellence of the body, over material excellence, right? So it's true, I think one has to say, that ancient Greece and the Middle Ages did not put their energies into material developments, even though their contributions, their main energies into material developments, even though their contributions were what made them possible later on, right? Whereas the modern world has tended to emphasize technology and material advancement, over the classical and medieval idea of the excellence of the soul, we could say. So I think that there is something to what Dewey say, but let's not make it into an either or thing, right? Those two things can be balanced against each other. As we've seen, I think, from the experience of 20th century technology, it can be used for good and it can be used for evil, right? Look at the two world wars and the Holocaust and all these horrors we experienced in the 20th century, many of them empowered by modern technology. So technology and the enhancement of human powers, which is key, I think, to the modern project of Bacon, is only good, I would argue, to the degree that they are deployed with wisdom and virtue, right? And maybe there could be some value to bringing these two things into harmony. But at all events, being exposed to both emphases, the classical and the modern emphasis in this regard, I don't think costs anybody anything. In fact, I think it's quite valuable, and maybe bringing these two sides into balance could be something that is needed at this point in history. So
I think you make a very interesting point there, Alex, in your recap of the 20th century. The horrors you talk about were facilitated not only by technology, but by an instrumental attitude, including an instrumentalization of the human being, which facilitated the demonic use of technology. So through the charnel house of modern history, the individual human is not seen in the kind of light where you see Myron's Discobolus, for example. It's a unit, an inconvenience or a convenience. And I think you also picked up on something interesting in your response to Dewey, the succession of an attitude of appreciation where one sees far by standing on the shoulders of giants. It gets replaced by an attitude of, so to speak, the ungrateful grandchild, where the paternity and the grandpaternity of our ideas and our capabilities are discarded in favor of a kind of year zero mentality and a perennial celebration of the new. So,
absolutely. And the other thing I wanted to say about Dewey was also about the way in which he understands democracy as being hostile, let's say, to the classical ideal. I just wanted to make that point because I think it's important to talk about that, because I think the classics still do have, in some people's mind, an elitist image, right? And he thinks that this distinction between the liberal and the practical is really based on the antiquated class structures of ancient Greece and Europe, right? And so I think that that's worth talking about. And I think the important point to make is, yes, there's no doubt historically the Greeks and European civilizations had a very strong class structure. But the question is whether that is necessary, a necessary part of the classical educational ideal. And I would say that what is essential there is much more the distinction of activities, right? That anyone can, because Aristotle says that human nature itself is servile, right? It's not so much, let's not talk so much about the distinction between servile and liberal people, but servile and liberal activity. Human nature has necessities, and so both of these aspects of human nature, let's say the necessary and the liberal, right, need to be developed. But I think it's also important to emphasize that to the degree that we can talk about divisions, I think in the classical ideal is much more, the requisites were much more zeal for virtue, excellence, and wisdom, right? That is because if you think about Socrates, right, came from a rather humble background, was poverty-stricken his entire life, right? He hardly represented the upper crust of Athenian society. And yet the depth of admiration that the great philosophers had for him was virtually boundless. Epictetus, the great Stoic philosopher, was a slave, right? And then you look at the Renaissance, you have people like Vittorino da Feltre, who virtually bankrupted, I mean, in other words, the pecuniary interest of his school suffered because he gave so much room to free, without charging tuition, to students who may have had lower class background socio-economically, but who displayed the kind of love of learning, love of wisdom, love of the virtues that he was looking for. So that I don't think the tradition has ever been quite as exclusive as as Dewey seems to want to portray it. Making the contingent class structures of ancient antiquity the core of what classical education is all about. So.
That's a very helpful response, Alex, and it's certainly one of our impulses at Petrarch is an idea of classics for everyone. It's a notion which I think we take from the founding fathers of classicism, as you've just illustrated. It also goes back to the point that behind philosophy, for example, the philosophy of Dewey and pragmatism, there is often ideology. So, Alex, can you recap what we said about that last week and offer a response on that front on behalf of classicism?
Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, this sort of came to a head. There were movements that began in the '60s, but really came to a head in the late '80s and early 1990s that had sort of a generalized critique of what they saw as the non-inclusive, right? Elitist, even racist, a focus on what they saw as Eurocentrism, right? In other words, that the curriculum was too focused on European achievement, and the classics, of course, suffer along with that because they're sort of foundational, originally, at least, right? Originally to European culture, and so there was kind of a move. They started being movements to push. At Stanford, we talked about how, at Stanford and in many other institutions of higher learning, Western civilizational requirements were dropped, right? Whereas the classics and later Western canon courses used to be required, they were really dropped through the '90s, so that today it's very hard to find colleges and universities which have requirements in this area. We talked about the curriculum of inclusion, which was one of the documents that set it off, and I believe it was 1988. It was a task force from the New York State Board of Regents, and it wrote, among other things, African Americans, Asian Americans, Puerto Ricans, Latinos, and Native Americans have all been the victims of an intellectual and educational oppression that has characterized the culture and institutions of the United States and the European American world for centuries, it also states European culture is likened to the master of a house ruling over a dinner table, himself firmly established at the head of the table, and all other cultures being guests from some distance down the table from the master, who has invited the others through his beneficence. So we have this image of this, very non-inclusive, prejudicial culture which has sort of imposed itself. So it's probably worthwhile to sort of address that issue a little bit. No? So one of the things is, I don't think we could say that there's any problem with the notion of inclusion, right? In other words, why not? If Confucius and the architecture of the Taj Mahal and the great achievements of non-Western civilizations have not received enough attention, I don't see any problem, right? These are part of the great inheritance of human civilizations. Any problem including them? The problem I see is that European civilization has been characterized as little more than, been reduced to little more than a legacy of repression and oppression, right? And it talks about, right, that it has produced aggressive individuals and nations that were ready to discover and invade foreign lands because of greed, racism, and national egoism, right? Wherever one ranks European civil, there's no doubt that these things have occurred in the history of the West as well as in the history of the non-West, right? Empire building, tribal xenophobia, wars have been tragic parts of the human condition, right? That said, and however we rate, European civilization, it's also in history had a few accomplishments, right? And if one thinks about, I mean, we've talked about this before, if one thinks about the figure of Newton in the natural sciences and Michelangelo in the visual arts and Aristotle in philosophy and Shakespeare in literature, we think about all these figures. What they all have in common is their deep immersion in the classics, which are a tradition of learning which are open to people of all races, religions, ethnicities, right? So in that sense, it's not exclusive. Secondly, I mean, I have a little trouble with the assumption that simply because a given individual does not have personal roots in Europe, right? So simply because their ancestry came from somewhere else, that they cannot appreciate and gain anything from encountering the great minds of the classical tradition. Just as a Westerner can be awed by the beauty of the Taj Mahal without being himself or herself Indian or Islamic, and just as a Westerner can find wisdom in the Analects of Confucius, there's no reason why someone whose ancestry happens to be non-European should feel oppressed and not be able to gain anything fruitful from reading Aristotle, right, or Socrates. And the last thing to say is the focus on self-esteem in this approach is a little bit disturbing in the fact that self-esteem can be, of course, an important thing, but should it be the main, producing a certain psychological effect on the students, right? Should that be the main focus of education, right? Should we be concerned principally with that issue, the possibility that, and I think like Aristotle in his Nicomachean Ethics says something interesting because he's talking about he wants to make certain critiques of the Platonic system, but he's wondering whether he ought to because of the fact that it may hurt the feelings of the Platonists, right? And may even create conflicts with his friends, right? And he writes, so perhaps it would appear desirable, right? Perhaps it would appear desirable, that is not to say those things. And indeed, it would seem obligatory, especially for a philosopher, to sacrifice even one's closest personal ties in defense of the truth. Both are dear to us, yet 'tis our duty to prefer the truth, right? So the point is that the goal of education, understood in the classical sense, is to aim at truth, and not necessarily, to produce a given psychological effect in the students. Which anyway, I again find a bit dubious, right? Why anyone should feel oppressed by their encounter of the great minds of antiquity is something difficult to understand, whatever legitimate critiques they may have about things that have been done, in the name of or by representatives of Western civilization in the past. So that would be my response there.
Well, by way of confirming your last point, Alex, of course, what we found is an appreciation and an interest in these classical themes from people who visited the website and joined our various fora from literally every continent in the world, countries all over the world.
Absolutely, 100%. I mean, I feel enriched when I, read about the classics of India and China, right, and other civilizations. these are the contributions of the Western classics. So I would think that it would be equally so, regardless of what one's personal origins. I think it should be a non-issue.
That's certainly what we found, and you mentioned a little earlier in our discussion today, Alex, the idea of the classics, or the classicists of the early days starting a conversation which has an indefinite ability to roll on. So for people around the world who want to join us in conversation, what are some of the venues in which they can do that?
Yeah, so, besides obviously our courses, and again, our website, www.petrarch-institute.com, and you just email me if you're interested. One of my favorites would be LinkedIn, where we have a lot of conversations on themes related to the classics and classical learning, and some of the discussions that we had there have ended up becoming podcasts. We're also on Facebook. And Miles, you want to tell them a little on Twitter, about Twitter?
Also to be found on Twitter, where you can find us under Petrarch Center, CENTRE, and there is news about our podcast, courses, and other topics of interest there, and a kind of community of people with shared interests in the inheritances from around the world from days of yore. With that, Alex, we want to look forward to seeing people in those various settings down the road.
Okay, everyone, I hope you found this podcast fruitful, and I hope to see you in our course. Speak to you all soon. Bye-bye.
See you all next.